I was never the type of guy to be very religious. I grew up going to church every now and then, more because of my parents than by my own will. And even as an adult, with the rush of work as a construction superintendent and helping out as a coach for my children's sports, life always seemed too busy to stop and think about spiritual things. I believed in God, of course, but in that automatic way, as if going to church on Sundays and doing good was enough. I never imagined that one day I would be here, writing this, with tears in my eyes, trying to describe something that simply changed everything for me. It all happened at a time that was supposed to be joyful, my eldest son's wedding. Everything was all set, the family gathered, that wonderful hustle and bustle of a big event. A couple of days before the ceremony, I started feeling some pains in my abdomen, sort of like cramps, and along with that came chills and fever. I thought it was some kind of virus or spoiled food. Nothing serious. But the pain kept increasing, and stubborn as I was, I decided to put it off and enjoy my son's wedding. I didn't want to miss anything, absolutely nothing of that moment. I smiled for the photos, hugged the guests, but inside, I was almost fainting from pain. The day after the wedding, I was practically dragging myself. The fever increased, the pain became unbearable, and I could barely stand. It was only then that my wife, frightened by my condition, convinced me to go to the hospital. On the way to the emergency room, I remember everything seemed a bit blurry, as if I were gradually drifting away from reality. Once there, they put me on a stretcher, drew blood, and did some tests, and soon the worried looks began. One of the doctors told me that my appendix had probably ruptured 3 days earlier. I had a generalized infection and they needed to operate on me immediately. They said time was against me. I looked at my wife, trying to convey some assurance, but inside I already felt that I was on the edge of something very serious. It was as if my body were slowly shutting down. It wasn't just fatigue. It was a sense of an ending. I remember being taken to the operating room. The hospital lights flashed quickly above the stretcher and everything felt surreal. The pain was no longer the center of my attention. It was the strange peace that began to envelop me, as if something much greater were about to happen. When they placed me on the surgical table, I looked up at the ceiling and thought, it's now. It wasn't fear that I felt, but a mix of surrender and curiosity, as if my body were saying, you've reached where you needed to be. And then, suddenly, everything changed. There was no slow transition. In the blink of an eye, I was no longer in that room. The sounds of the machines vanished. The doctors disappeared, and by my side, he was there. I don't know how to explain this in a way that makes sense, but it was Jesus, not in a symbolic sense. I'm saying that he was there, real, present, looking straight into my eyes. And when he looked, it was as if he saw every part of me, not only what I was in that moment, but everything I had been and everything I had hidden. His face was not like the ones we see in paintings or movies. It can't be compared. It was as if there were light within him, but not a blinding light. It was a light that heals, that understands. His eyes, man, I had never seen anything like them. They didn't judge, didn't demand, yet at the same time, they knew everything. It was as if he were looking straight into my soul, and yet there was not the slightest hint of shame, only love. A love so strong, so pure, that it broke me inside. I felt my legs give way, but there was no body. It wasn't a dream, it wasn't delirium. It was more real than anything I had ever experienced. I knew I was outside my body, and there was no confusion. There was clarity. I understood that this was more real than life itself, as if the world we live in were just a shadow of what is true. And then he spoke, not with words coming from a mouth, but in a way that invaded my very being. He said that he was there because of a prayer that I had forgotten. At first I was confused, but he continued to show me, to remind me. And then it came like a flash from my childhood. I must have been about 7 years old, alone in my room, on my knees on the bed, with my hands together and my eyes closed. I had cried that day because I had heard a story at church about heaven, and I remember asking God with all the innocence in the world that one day he would let me see heaven. That was it, a simple, childlike, forgotten prayer, but he remembered. Jesus was there, years later, to answer that prayer. He held my hand, in a firm yet gentle way, as if to say, now come with me. As soon as he touched me, everything around began to change again. The already strong light intensified, yet it still didn't hurt my eyes. It was a living light, as if it had feelings of its own. And suddenly, I was no longer in that white environment. I was somewhere else. A field, infinite, sown with a peace so profound that it made me completely forget my pain, the surgery, the hospital, the world. The place where I found myself was simply perfect. There is no other word. The ground was covered with grass so green and alive that it seemed to shine on its own, as if every blade of grass had its own light. But it wasn't just the beauty. It was the feeling. I felt every particle of that place with an intensity that is impossible to describe. The flowers, for example, moved as if they were dancing, yet there was no wind. It was as if the very environment were alive, in complete harmony with something greater, something holy. Far on the horizon, you could see a city, with white towers and golden domes that shone with a kind of light that did not come from the sun, but from God's very presence. Mountains in the background, covered with pine trees so symmetrical that they seemed to be planted one by one, and a sky that wasn't blue, but a gradient of colors that moved gently, as if the sky were breathing. And even with all of this happening at once, nothing seemed overdone. Everything was exactly as it should be. The only thing I could do was kneel down. When my knees touched that ground, I felt as if all the weight of my life had been lifted from me. It was as if I were whole for the first time. No pain, no worry, no guilt. Only the absolute certainty that I was in the presence of something sacred. I saw beams of light coming from above, as if God's presence were pouring His glory over that place. Those beams seemed to have intelligence, purpose. They moved with grace and power, illuminating everything around with an intensity that made me want to cry, but not from sadness. It was a cry of fullness. I knew without anyone needing to explain that I was in the presence of the Creator. And it was at that moment that everything fell silent. A silence that was not empty, but full of meaning. It was as if time itself had stopped. I felt small but not insignificant. On the contrary, I felt deeply loved, known, and accepted. That's when I understood. I was seeing heaven. And more than that, I was home. I don't know how long I stayed there on my knees. It could have been seconds or an eternity. There, time doesn't work like it does here. There's no rush, nor the feeling that something is being wasted. It's as if every moment were complete, entirely fulfilled. I remember looking at Jesus again. He said nothing, but his gaze was enough. It was as if he were showing me that all of this wasn't a reward or a punishment. It was an answer. It was love responding to love. When our eyes met, I felt as if he were telling me that my time down here was not yet over. And honestly, a part of me didn't want to go back. That was everything I never knew I needed. But, at the same time, there was an understanding within me that my mission wasn't finished yet. It was as if I understood that my presence in the world still had a purpose, that there were still people who needed me. And at that moment, out of nowhere, a strong pain pierced my chest. The first pain in all that time. Everything went dark for an instant. It was like being forcefully pulled back, like a stretched elastic suddenly released. I felt my body again, felt the weight, the limitations, the pain, the shrill sound of monitors, and the shock of the defibrillator. I was back. I opened my eyes with difficulty, confused, as if waking from a place that was more real than life itself. The doctors' faces were tense, and I heard one of them say something like, "He's back." Gradually, I started piecing it together. I was in the ICU, intubated, with marks on my chest from the defibrillator. One of the doctors later told me that my case was one of the worst he had ever seen someone survive. I had truly died. For a few moments my heart had stopped, but I came back. Only I wasn't the same man. I was alive, but I was different inside. Something within me had been touched in a way that could no longer be ignored. I knew what I had seen, and even without being able to explain it all, I could no longer deny it. In the days that followed, I could barely speak about what had happened. Every time I tried to tell my wife, my voice would catch, and tears would come without warning. It wasn't sadness. It was something deeper, as if my soul were trying to find words for something beyond human vocabulary. I spent days just staring at the hospital ceiling, recalling every detail, trying to understand why I had been brought back. The doctor said it was a miracle. The nurse called me the survivor. But I knew that it was more than luck or coincidence. I had received a visit, and not just from anyone. I had been with Jesus. I saw him, I touched him, and he took me to heaven. As surreal as it may seem, it was all real. I only managed to tell my wife after a week, and even then, my voice trembled. When I finished, she cried as much as I did. From then on, nothing was the same. Going back home was strange. The same walls, the same furniture, the same sounds, but I felt everything differently. Every detail seemed to have a new meaning. I remember eating a banana at breakfast and stopping halfway to cry. It was just a banana, but for the first time, I realized the miracle of being alive to taste it. I began to stroll more slowly through the streets, observing the trees, the sky, the faces of people. Life, which before was an endless cycle of commitments and tasks, now seemed like a giant gift, wrapped in details I had never noticed. I started taking pictures of flowers, of clouds, of anything that reminded me of that light. I stopped rushing so much. I learned to take a deep breath, and most importantly, I began to truly seek Jesus, not as a Sunday ritual, but as someone who had been touched by him. My faith stopped being theoretical. Now it was relational. I didn't just believe, I knew him, and that changed everything. Over time, I began to understand that the experience I had was not just for me. It was something I needed to share, even if it wasn't easy to find the right words. I started sharing my testimony in small discussion groups, then in church groups, and today, whenever I have the opportunity, I tell someone, not to impress, but to remind them that God hears, even those forgotten childhood prayers, and that he acts, even when we can't even imagine it. Sometimes people ask me if I'm sure of what I saw. I can only answer, I was there. There's no way someone can leave that place the same. When I remember Jesus telling me that he came because of that old prayer, I feel something that no rational explanation can erase. The kind of love that sees us completely and yet chooses to take us by the hand. Most people live as if heaven were a distant idea, but I know, with every part of my being, that it is more real than this very ground. And that eternity began for me on that day when my eyes were opened to what had always been there, waiting. Today, I have 13 grandchildren whom I might never have met if I hadn't come back. Every hug from them, every laugh in the backyard, every bedtime story, all became part of a greater mission. I'm not perfect. I remain a human being full of flaws, but now I walk differently, lighter, more present, more aware. Sometimes, alone in my room, I look up at the sky and give thanks. Other times, I sit in silence and just let the tears fall, because it's hard to put into words what it means to know, with absolute certainty, that Jesus is real, that he cares, and that he comes to meet us even when we've long forgotten what we asked for. I could have died in that operating room. In fact, I did die, but I came back with a new heart. And now everything I do is with the intention of honoring that hand that held me. Because on the day I close my eyes again, I want it to be with the same peace I felt in that heavenly field, knowing that he will be there once more, waiting for me, just the same. There are days when I still wake up in the middle of the night with that image in my mind, the look in Jesus' eyes, that living light around me, and the feeling of being exactly where I belonged. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't my brain playing tricks on me. I know this because nothing invented by our mind can cause the kind of transformation that it did in me. Before, I was just another guy trying to get through life. Today, I am someone who saw what lies beyond life, and that completely changes how we see the present. I am no longer afraid of death. Of course, I want to live and enjoy my family, my friends, my grandchildren. But if my day comes tomorrow, I know who will be waiting for me. Not by merit, but by grace, because he is real, and he even remembers a child's prayer made in any room decades ago. And perhaps the craziest part of it all is this: having lived something so profound, so unforgettable, and yet not being able to explain it properly. The experience ended as quickly as it began. One second I was on my knees in that perfect field. The next, I was back, surrounded by doctors and machines. There was no warning. There was no farewell. Just an abrupt transition, as if someone had switched off a light. And since then, I've been trying to find ways to tell what I lived, but it always seems like something is missing, as if words were never enough. I only know that it happened, and that even after all this time, I still find myself looking at the sky, missing that place. There isn't a day that goes by without me thinking about it. And even if no one believes it, even if they think it was just delirium, it doesn't matter. Because I know what I saw, I know who I met, and I know that when the right time comes, he will be there again, waiting for me.